with that, I want to introduce Nomzamo and give you all a bit of background. Nomzamo is a human rights lawyer, a holistic health coach, and a yoga teacher. She's an inspiring author and she's the co-owner of the Toolbox. Toolbox is a wellness center and yoga studio that she founded with her sister Sizwe, who's also on the call with us. And the mission of the Toolbox is to share tools and create health and make holistic health accessible. And if any of you are from the Toolbox space, or if any of you have the kind of privilege of being able to go there, if you're ever in Durban, this is an incredible space. It's one of the most integrated and diverse places. There's everything. I've taught herbalism there, there's capoeira, there's salsa sometimes, and then there's a whole range of really incredible yoga programs as well. And yoga being part of my personal practice, it's been an important place for me. So this is today one of the other sides of Nomzamo, and I would really just like to give the floor over to her and to hear about what this restorative justice, what law as a healing profession is all about. And with that, take it away, Nomzamo.
Great. Hello, everybody. It's so awesome to see family and friends. It does make the space feel warm and I can feel like really good energy. It's my first webinar ever. So I'm a little bit nervous, but here I am. And I think what I've decided is that I'm just going to kind of talk through my journey. And so it's not necessarily a manual for everyone about how to merge these worlds, but I think I'm information. My strategy is emergent, and I've kind of got these guideposts and sort of beacons that I'm looking towards in helping me shape what I'm becoming and the type of work that I want to do in the world. And I think that this journey in itself has been healing for me. And so hopefully through that experience, I can share something which maybe other people can connect to. I wasn't sure, and I'm glad to see there aren't that many lawyers, so it's not going to be quite technical. I was hoping that it's something which is kind of broadly relatable to a lot of people, and I think that I'm largely talking about integrative law, which is multidisciplinary anyways, and it does draw on different aspects. So hopefully everyone can find something within this. So I think I'm going to start going. I know that sometimes like people post things in chats and that I'm not that great at keeping up with both. So maybe I'll go and then at some juncture I'll kind of pause and see, and then see if there's any kind of communication. But yeah, so I'm just, it's a conversation. I will, if I see something or if I see a hand and I'm not making sense, stop. But otherwise I'll kind of go and then we can, I'd love to discuss a little bit after.
Yeah.
So,
I'll be here monitoring the chat, and also just to let you all know that Zama will talk for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we're going to have some breakout rooms to discuss, and then come back to the main room and get like loads of time to ask questions. So if you've got like a desperate question you put in the chat, we can totally like converse about it, but there is a lot of dialogue built into the design. Okay.
Fantastic, thanks. So I went into law because I wanted to make the world a better place. I have been raised by activists, political activists. So I had a very real close contact with the idea that through deliberate strategy and sacrifice, that you can build the world that you want. And so I think it's something that I just had a strong sense of this idea of justice and fairness and being willing to put your life where your mouth is, in a way. I also, on the other side, was, experienced the fallout of activists who didn't necessarily put their emotional and personal well-being at the forefront. They sometimes sacrifice that to the bigger objectives. And I think having experienced the other side of that and what that meant as well, it's also sort of shaped my idea of just the consequences of sometimes choosing goals and not looking and not taking care of yourself holistically. Anyway, so I went to law school bright-eyed, and my favorite show used to be LA Law. That was just my show, and I just wanted to be a lawyer because that's how I was going to save the world. Law school was alienating and sterile, I think, in a way. I think that obviously I I dealt with it because I was learning the technical tools of the trade, which would allow me to participate in this profession. I'm pretty diligent, so I was willing to study what I had to do. But I think there were certain discomforts that I always felt along the way. You know, sort of in criminal law, we had these notions of the reasonable man, which always felt quite like one-dimensional, didn't quite relate to them, didn't really take into account very Eurocentric sort of standard. Foundations of South African law was big emphasis on foreign jurisprudence, very little African law. And besides the actual subject matter of our courses, I found the process of legal reasoning quite constraining. So we're taught very it's quite a narrow thing about what's considered relevant and what's considered irrelevant, like what facts count and which facts don't, and also what you can bring into it, because there's this thing about objectivity and kind of having a distance. So how you feel about the situation personally, your emotions, your instincts, those are not considered things that are valid to the issue. And also, I think that what I realized is that because the subject matter was a bit because the subject matter with a lot of our courses was quite Eurocentric and didn't involve a lot of our contextual factors and what was happening around in South Africa, it actually also influenced the institutional culture of the university. So I was the chairperson of the Black Law Students Forum, and I did a survey trying to look at what is the institutional culture and how, and if there's a difference between the different races. And the Black students had the biggest problems with the institutional culture, and part of it had to do with the material that they were studying and not feeling that they could relate to it. So all of these things, I suppose I'm just mentioning the process of legal training because I think that it's also relevant in shaping how we become lawyers. And I think that was my first sense of kind of like discontent, because I felt like, in fact, my final sort of essay when I was applying to the Constitutional Court was about how, as law students, we need to be taught a more contextual application of the law. And that, you know, at the time, you know, there was quite a bit about judicial, like gender and sensitivity training for the judiciary, you know, so the judges who are going to become, and they have to undergo this training. And I, you know, for me, it was like, why are we starting at the tail end? You know, judges are getting sort of gender training and sensitivity training, whereas this is something which should be planted and started in law school, and that by the time you're a judge, it's something that you've walked into the world with. So I found that quite problematic. Anyways, be that as it may, went to the Constitutional Courts, and that was quite an inspiring space for me because it was about values and it was about a normative framework and a space that was being built. So I think I felt a little bit more whole there because I felt like I was part of a society building project. This was still in the days when we were bright-eyed about the Constitution. I'm now in another place, and I'm questioning whether the Constitution is actually purpose-made and if it can really solve the structural problems of our country. But that's, at that stage, I was excited about it. And so that was the Concord, and it was really a space in which I think I was inspired, as I was saying, inspired because there was this normative framework and this country that we're building. And also being the highest court in South Africa, I got to see some of the best lawyers. And so I had this kind of aspirational, I want to be that person there one day. Went to the bar and I became an advocate. And I think for me, practice was in some ways really stimulating and great. I mean, I had the privilege of working in the areas of refugee law. I did land, sex worker rights, lots of work in education. So I continued in constitutional law. And I think in that sense, I got to cut my teeth. So that was great. But I think the personal dynamics of practice were quite difficult for me. It's quite a masculinized environment. There's a lot around kind of always having to be on top of it and, you know, not being able to really bring your emotions and who you are into the space. At that stage, I was quite a raging perfectionist. So it was a good environment for me because there's so much to prove and seem like you've got it. And there was no space to not cope or not be coping. That doesn't really come up. That's sort of something that you keep to yourself. And there's this kind of a sense of you just keep going and going and going. I'd look at my seniors and I didn't balance that they struck. I mean, what also struck me is that as men, they were able to maintain their private lives because they had women keeping their lives going. Whereas as a woman in that space, I experienced quite my life became one-dimensional. I could kind of only work because I didn't have anyone else to sort of keep the home fires burning and everything else. And I think that aspect of practice, also how I think being an advocate is quite exclusive. Well, it can be, and a lot of people who I would have wanted to help or couldn't necessarily afford the fees that I was, and I was very aware of just kind of how expensive it is. So there were certain values of mine which I felt at conflict with, and so when I chose to leave law, I just for me it was a case of I could feel myself hardening. I could feel myself having to silence certain voices within me, which was actually kind of easy for me to do because I struggle with vulnerability anyway. So I was just getting into a space where I had to be less and less vulnerable, more and more of an appearance. But you know, when you can feel yourself developing in a way and you're just like, I'm not really feeling this development. And I luckily had the sense that no one can take my qualification away from me, but I need to go and find out who I am outside of this thing and find a way to feel more whole. Because as I said, I was feeling quite one-dimensional. So I left law, and because at the time it wasn't actually anything to do with yoga and that, but along the journey I found yoga. And I think for me why I took to yoga so much is because it was a space for me to navigate that who am I question. When you change your career and you don't have a profession, you really are it can be an identity crisis given like our capitalist world and how your identity is based on what you do. But here was a space in which I was actually asking like, who are you, on that real sort of way. And I had the space to navigate that. And so I think for me, yoga just kind of became that, what do I say? It was something that I could hold on to in a space where I was sort of feeling like I didn't have a place yet anymore. And so anyways, one day, fast forward, I'm listening to a podcast and I've left law behind. And I actually was quite, it was almost like that breakup. I went cold turkey, didn't want to know about it. My mom was like, oh, he's such a lawyer. I was like, no, man, I don't do that anymore. I just kind of wanted to cut off from that. And I'm listening to this podcast, and it had to do with, it was Pauline Tesla, and she's the founder of the integrative law movement. And she began the podcast, and she's talking about how, most lawyers either become very hard and bitter and like addicted and depressed because of the circumstances, the kind of because they aren't able to like navigate the personal circumstances, or they just leave because their heart is broken. And I remember I burst into tears because I was like, it's me. I was heartbroken. And I think for me, I hadn't really, so it was just hearing it framed in that way. And what was really, and the reason why I'm talking about my feelings so much, if you're wondering like why, is because it's something that I've learned through my practice. And what I've had to sort of relearn is that emotions matter and they're valid, and they are also a source of intelligence, and they're something which can guide us. And so I think part of my survival in that space was to deny my emotions. And so part of healing was reclaiming them. And so even me speaking about them in this space is part of that, like, because I think we do kind of see those as like sort of soft issues, but in the type of law that I'm envisioning, this matters because we have to be able to bring our whole selves into it. So anyways, what I learned a lot through yoga teaching, and that I think what it taught me about healing, and that was just the extent to which so many people are kind of moving and living from a dysregulated nervous system, so much pressure, stress, grief, trauma, and people are living, we've got two aspects of our nervous system. There's the rest and digest where we heal side, and that comes from relaxation, and then there's the stress response that comes when we're in fight or flight mode. And most of our modern life keeps us in that fight or flight mode. And the thing about that space is that you can't really dream from that space. You can't imagine. It's a survival space, so more than a thriving space. And it's compounded by exhaustion and worry and all of that. And I think that what happens is that in legal conflicts, you've often got people who are in that sort of fight or flight state, and then it can be, legal situations are often exacerbated because the lawyer themselves is also coming in with that exhausted, burnt out, on the verge. So you've got this mix of these people who are in crisis being supposed to be healed or helped or resolved by other people who are also in some level of crisis. And I think that this is kind of what is underlying a lot of the antagonism that's within traditional legal disputes. And I think, and the other part, which was really like breath of fresh air, was when she spoke about how recognizing that people are in parasympathetic system, or that recognizing the stress response, that kind of stuff is important. So sorry, I'm skipping a step. So she works in integrative law, and part of integrative law is collaborative law. And that was born from the divorce space, because what they realized was that, divorce is so traumatic, not only for the people who are being divorced, but also for the children as well. And most of the time when people are getting divorced, they are in that stress state, that, fight or flight mode. And when you are in that fight or flight stress state, as I mentioned, you're in your lizard brain, you're in survival mode, and you're not in that neocortex part of the brain. And so the types of decisions that you make are not necessarily going to be the most creative. They're not going to solve anything. And so what collaborative law is a response to that. And they said, okay, let us, taking into account this neuroscience, taking into account the sort of stress, and also realizing that people argue about the external estate, but what's actually at stake in a divorce is the internal estate. That's really what you are, because you don't know who you're going to be afterwards, but you're going to play it out on who's going to have the couch or not. And so that was one area in which this expanded notion of law, where you actually wanted to heal and make the situation better, came out of it. Was collaborative law started in divorce. And one of the principles of collaborative law is that you have a team of lawyers who are there to reach a compromise. And if they can't reach a settlement, you actually fire them and you have to get new lawyers. So they're actually incentivized to solve the problem amicably. And if they can't, then they're in a way fired. So this is one area in which collaboration is actually incentivized, because we do say in law, litigation is a last sort of resort. But the structural system which you operate, either billing or trying to keep up on all of that, doesn't support you to settle and solve things. So this collaborative law is quite it's an approach which is used. It started in divorce, but can come in many. And the other aspect of collaboration, is that the team is a joint one. So in a divorce, you have the same financial person, you have the same, it's a shared team, and they're looking after the interests of both of you. And it's quite great because you can actually do antenuptials now and say that I want to divorce collaboratively. And they involve things like visualization, like remember when you actually loved each other. They do mindfulness to try to get people out of that stress response and into another part of their brain. So that's one area which I was quite inspired about, like, oh, this stuff is possible. And then another way in which integrative law has been successful is in medical malpractice, because there too, if you acknowledge sort of the whole human being, is that people naturally, when something's gone wrong, they want to apologize. But because of how things are overly litigated, it becomes about fault and liability. So the truth becomes lost in that. And actually what most people want is just an acknowledgement that something happened. So they found that in certain hospitals in the States, but where they allowed nurses and doctors to just respond naturally, to say sorry if they felt like it, or, not to be told by the lawyer how to respond, the cases went down drastically, and that's also just bringing in the human element of, I just want an acknowledgement. So I think sometimes the way things go on and on and on is because no one's trying to recognize what had gone wrong. And so that was another area. And so the big thing about collaborative law, integrative law, there's this new movement. It's called the comprehensive law movement, integrative law. There are different sort of vectors of it, and people find, so it's quite a rich field. But the one thing about it is that, you want to facilitate some sort of a positive outcome, something that's going to increase harmony. And it's also going to, and there's this notion of rights plus. So beyond pure legal entitlements, it's about needs, it's about resources, it's about the community, it's about emotional well-being, it's about, preventing future. It's rights plus, because I think right now it's just so crude. I have a right, you don't have a right, and then there we are clashing about that. But like, and I haven't been in practice. Sometimes you win, you get the judgment, you were right and on the rights, but it's empty. And I think because of all of the other emotional, psychological toll that surrounds it, but it's kind of invisibilized, and there's no space to acknowledge that. Anyway, so these two things were really, for me, like, oh my gosh, another legal world is possible where people are even bringing this into the equation. And, for me, it's kind of also, as I've gone further, is looking at the fact that this type of rethinking about law and what justice is quite urgent, especially for formerly, like we a colony, our legal systems are a legacy of colonialism and imbue a certain vision of the type of colonial state that would be wanted, So even with when we look at, I was working at the homeless rights and or looking at how the city was treating homeless people, and you see that so many of the vagrant laws and begging laws are just all leftovers of the fantasy of like the colonial state in which not all citizens are supposed to be a part of. And so when we don't, but when we look at the impacts of laws, when we look at whole people, then we're able to kind of look holistically at the whole thing. So for me, looking at the roots of where the systems come from is part of what the solution would then be. And so, yeah, so it's just also, I think with this type of movement, is just that recognition that laws are not neutral. They create values, they perpetuate values. And so in order to create new legal systems, there's a possibility of like, what are the new values and what can they be imbued? It's not just kind of, we sometimes have a sense, that these that it just is like that. No, it was made to be like that. And so for me, it's about recognizing that, in choosing other types of values, then we can recreate a system which actually serves the people and is not trying to create some sort of a colonial state. I think there's probably other ways to say it, but right now that's all I can think of. So, and the other thing what happened with this legacy of like secular colonialism is that it displaced other notions of justice and other ways of thinking about justice. Their principles within, I mean, I think at most maybe we hear like Ubuntu as a philosophy and was recognized in the Constitutional Court, but it's not often like an active lived. It's sort of in some cases now and then. So, I mean, there's still scope there. But I was listening to there's a lovely Kenyan ecologist, and she mentioned a saying in Swahili, and it's the exact same as a saying that we have in Zulu, and it's umuntu akalashwa, which means that you don't throw a person away. Like, well, that's literal, but you can't get rid of people, and I always understood that in a family context, like when you've just got that child, which you're just going to have to love through it. But she then was talking about how that influences justice and how, if people can't be thrown away, and then locking up isn't really, we need to look at more holistic, regenerative ways of justice, which take the people, the so-called offenders or whatever, along with, rather than solutions which kind of have wrong and right. And so what does it mean if we believe that everybody is part of the system? And what would that mean for types of solutions that we then investigate? And so when we bring in those kinds of indigenous notions, maybe not necessarily in relation to justice, but it makes it's such a richer way of possibly solving disputes. And also this notion of seeing legal disputes as dis-ease, and that in order to restore harmony, you have to look beyond the personal, but also the collective. And another notion, which I think is quite interesting, is that in West Africa, they talk of sankofa, which is represented by a bird, but it's this idea that you can always go back. You can always, things don't expire or prescribe. You can always go back. And I think, we've got notions of prescription and now it's done. But when you do sort of ancestral or healing work, you just realize that these things are over lifetimes. And for me, if you think about expanding time and that, what would that mean for how we look at justice and how we solve issues? So no, I don't necessarily have an answer, but I'm just saying if we're bringing these things into the room, I think it makes for a different quality of justice. And then at the moment, if I can talk about the framework, which I think is the most, which I'm relating to a lot and which I want to pursue and which I'm studying, is something called therapeutic jurisprudence. And therapeutic jurisprudence recognizes that the law is a social agent and that the law can either produce therapeutic consequences and untherapeutic consequences. And when the consequences are untherapeutic in terms of not making things better, then that's the space for reform. That's the place in which we question, how can we make this better? Because it's not actually healing and solving the problem. And it's based on a humanistic view of individuals. So it's very much about the impact on the emotional and the psychological well-being of people. And so you can apply it to a rule, like a legal rule. So saying, okay, what are the therapeutic consequences of this rule? You can, so it can be a rule, an actor, So for example, how a judge actually acts in court. So there were studies around judges who actually spoke to the offenders about their conditions and explain them in a language that they can understand. People are more likely to stick to the terms of the parole or whatever because the person engages. So it has to do also with the actual legal agents, and then also processes, different processes, and whether or not they're therapeutic or not. And once again, it's just bringing considerations into the space such that it guides how you approach issues. And then I think, I don't know how long I've been, but I feel like it's time for me to wrap up. Two more things. Is that I'm particularly interested in therapeutic jurisprudence in terms of making things better within the gender-based violence space, because I do feel like that is something which we are not solving with the criminal justice system. And it's an area in which I think it's particularly important to look at the whole individuals and look at like societal well-being and how we deal with it. So often, we have we've got a really high rate of femicide, and there'd be a cry for longer jail time and lock them up and they mustn't get bail. And I can see how those ideas are tempting, to sort of fall into, because we're all coming from that model of punitive, which, I mean, I don't want to ever diminish what they've done wrong. But I think that it's also kind of limiting if we think that locking people away is necessarily going to get to the root of the issue. And about 60% of people who are sexually violent have been sexually violated themselves. They come from hectic socioeconomic circumstances. So there's a reason, and I don't believe that anyone's a monster. I think there's monstrous behavior, and so it's about, if we bring that into the room and we recognize that these are hurt people hurting, what would that mean for how we approach these situations? And I think specifically because in our country, the partners are often, the offenders are often partners. They're someone so locking them up doesn't necessarily help. There's financial dependence on them. So we have to think broader about how we deal with these issues. And often, so there's that consideration. And also, the way that legal processes go, with the rape, for example, let's say, it has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. And that's quite a high standard. And what that means is that victims have to rehash their stories. There's a re-traumatization. So this is where therapeutic jurisprudence would come in, and you'll be like, is this, this process, are these therapeutic or anti-therapeutic consequences? And I think that re-traumatization within the court system is clearly not therapeutic. And so there's room to investigate. And if it sounds airy-fairy and abstract, I was really excited to meet, there are activists and feminists working on the ground who are creating rituals and looking at different ways in which to resolve things outside necessarily of the criminal justice system. I've seen also within the NGO space, there's a lot coming out around how much sexual violence is happening there. And these are people who are colleagues, they work together, they should know better. We think they should, they're in the human rights sphere, but and so within these sort of spaces where people are colleagues, friends, lovers, I think because their relations are intimate and layered, pure legal, solving on pure legal entitlements is not really one that's going to lead to like healing and resolution. And so that's my sort of, I think, impetus. I mean, and I think this can be applied in all different areas and that, but just my kind of reason why, because it's not working. And this other thing is that our legal systems globally are not working. There's like the tripartite crisis of the lawyers are sick, depressed, or addicted. Clients often don't get, they get disheartened, or they don't get the solutions that they want. And then the overall system itself just doesn't produce the outcomes that it wants to. So that's sort of where this is all situated. That kind of, I'd say that's my journey in that, recognizing a system which is so powerful and has so much potential, but as a social agent also creates and perpetuates so many different violences and injustice. And that when we see people as people with nervous systems and souls and memories and ancestors and these complex beings, what does it mean for how we practice? And that there's movements and there's lawyers who are willing to investigate it. So for me, I think it's also like to my future, to my past self, this is something I would have wanted to know. And I think as people who get burnt out or maybe want to leave, that there's ways within which you can possibly practice differently. And then the last thing, I know I said that before, sorry, is just what does it mean to be an integrative lawyer, and what are the types of values that they bring? And I think this is, I think, a good note for me to end, because I think that's the topic. So basically, integrative lawyers are reflective. So they reflect on their motivation, their purposes, and the human condition, and they bring that to the work around them. You know, they tend to bring their whole selves, their body, their mind, and their soul to work together to create a legal system. And so for me, that's like already like holistic. And I mean, for me, there's no healing without holism. So that's already, they tend to be guided by purpose and values, integrative lawyers. So, and the values are intrinsic rather than extrinsic. So law school is one of the places in which our values get a bit slanted, and you're sort of geared towards wanting to get a top, to be in a firm and be partner, or, you know, and so that doesn't really encourage you to connect with your own values. But integrative lawyers, that's really important. And they encourage integrity in them. So they don't want to do matters in which they don't feel like their integrity is being honored. They're also design thinkers, and they have a systemic view on the world. So they have an experience of the interconnectedness of all things, and that they recognize that society is becoming more complex, and it's necessary to embrace the complexity while seeking to make the law understandable and workable. And I think for me, that sense of interconnectedness obviously ties in so well with yoga and holistic health, and how everything feeds everything else, and that dis-ease is really caused when there's an aspect or a side that we don't acknowledge, and then they're also the harbingers of a new cultural consciousness and our leaders in social evolution. So for integrative law, it's not only about the legal procedures. It's a fundamental shift in worldview that expresses the shift. Their leaders, they're open to exploring and drawing upon many disciplines and wisdom traditions, such as philosophy, science, metaphysics, psychology, and spirituality. They bring this consciousness into the law and are partners with our colleagues in other disciplines. So yeah, I think I've said a lot, but this has kind of been my journey, and this is how I'm making sense, and I think, you know, there's potential. There's so much potential.
Thank you so much, Samuel. That was just brilliant, beautiful, lots of energy already happening in the chat. And I'm just going to start with the questions that were already written in. So Sarah Hughes wrote to us and said, to what extent do you think that the structure of the modern legal systems is designed for maintaining unequal power dynamics and systems of social control? And in that context, to what extent do you think that they can be reformed? And to what extent do you think that they must be completely reimagined? Great question.
I think they are totally designed to maintain unequal power dynamics, and they're sort of an arm of I think we can't ignore them. We can't separate them from their sort of capitalistic, you know, the law is like an enforcer and a maintainer of certain worldviews and systems. And I think that we're currently living in a what did you call it? The Patrix. I love that term. Patriarchal global matrix. This all there is heteronormative. Sorry, I'm like the words are finishing me. But I think that those things are all by design, and the law system has been part of the things which design them and maintains them. And this is part of, and these debates are happening really live within the constitutional space, you know, because we're looking at, we apparently have, for example, the most equal constitution, the best constitution in the world, but we're also the most poor country. And so it's about looking at to what extent these systems are purpose made. You know, they can do one thing, but can they solve the poverty? Can they solve the inequality? And so here we are with, and so it's that. So it's, they might, so they're not necessarily, I don't think within them they are agents of like change and social change. I think they're more about maintaining it. So I think, yes, we must imagine. How do you integrate your therapeutic legal work with your teaching practice? With your teaching practice, I think from my teaching practice, I'm able to bring in my understanding of what a person is, and I see them, and I validate all those aspects of them, and I'm alive to energies of space. And so for me, like, I would want to, I see my holistic law practice, we come in, we ground, we center, we check in before we go into things. And so I think embodiment, I didn't really get into that, But I think bringing in embodiment, breath, movement, and all of that is a really key part in also connecting people to themselves, and for the lawyers themselves and also the clients. So I think it informs my sense of who people are and what's possible. I believe in healing. I believe that things can change. I believe in creative solutions that can come from your body, not necessarily your mind. I believe that the mind is not the most important source of intelligence. I believe in instinct and intuition and other ways of knowing and being. So that does inform, I would say, practice. I don't know.
I had a follow-up question, actually.
From the chat, there's quite a few. Yeah, Dita.
Oh, so yeah, it's not quite related, but it was, so I was explaining to my group, I'm an environmental lawyer, I work in the NGO activist space, and I was thinking of some of the climate litigation that's going on at the moment, particularly against corporates. And you're in a situation where there's real inequality. These aren't two people against each other. This is a corporation set up for profit that's perhaps killing people, environmental defenders. So would you say there's still a role for law as a sword, where there are situations where that coming together and sharing, of course, corporate executives are humans and they have families and they have things they care about. But in terms of the way that that power balance is structured, are there situations where that kind of sitting together in that approach isn't what's needed, and you need that kind of litigation, that hard sort of sword of the law?
I hear you, right? And I was thinking about this because, Vida knows that I was working a little bit or involved in the Golobeni matter, where there was a company trying to take the rights for the titanium mining and all of that. And she, and in that context, I was thinking about, I believe in multi-pronged strategies, right? I think that, I think the multinational corporates, it's another type of beast, and these kind of, So yeah, I think at that stage, I believe in multi-pronged strategies. And even now, I was saying, someone asked me what I'm doing right now, but I'm in a team where we're looking at crafting a feminist response to sexual harassment and that. But within that, we've got a technical team. So we've got lawyers and then people who can, because when you're dealing with these things, part of the strategy is to assault you with documents and this and this and this and that. And if you can't deal with that, then you are possibly going to lose the battle. So we've got that technical team, but we're also then looking at how do we support people psychologically to debrief and do the other things. So that's even part of our strategy, is that you have to be savvy in order to counter that. But even within that, lawyers with your values can play the space. Or not even play the space, but can operate like differently. You can still have a lawyer who possibly sees you and all of that kind of stuff. So not to say, no, this doesn't trump or say that, okay, cool, we're going to be done with the normal systems all the time, because, but it's, so I just, if that's what the strategy needs, go for it. And other times, is this the most strategic thing to do? At least have the other options on the table available. But I often feel that people are so narrow that they just assume that that's the way to go. So it's about widening your range of options.
Yeah, and I think it's impossible to talk about ecological law and environmental activism without mentioning the movement to make ecocide a crime against humanity. I think that's at its highest level. I've been following the work of the late Polly Higgins and her foundation, so I think that's something very important to look into, because, and it's sort of like, at the moment, as soon as you're a corporation, you're legally bound to that making profit. There's no, even if you want to do good, there's no navigating around that. So until we have ecocide as a crime, it doesn't make sense. So I think exactly what Nomzamo said was the multiple approaches, but something that came up in our breakout room, and I actually want to go to a question in the chat for this, was the tendency to dehumanize the people on the other side. It's one thing to imagine family law, but when the person on the other side is, there's lots of examples where we can go, that person is too far gone, and call them monsters or something. But really the question that kind of stands out to me here is, do you agree with the abolish the police movement? What are the best alternatives in practice to police state? And perhaps this also speaks to the power issue that Gita raised.
Yes, I think that abolish the police, as in the one that's happening in America, and which I'm not feeling like, I've read so much, why can't I think what it is? But I think policing, there are too many roles that are placed on policing. So, you know, before police, because crimes are generally social issues, I think that there need to be more comprehensive social responses. So, you know, a big part of, I think, let's say, drug taking within certain communities is because of a lack of recreational activities. It's because the schools don't have anything after school, and, you know, there aren't options. And so when you kind of zoom out and look at the social aspects around which crime happens, I don't think the police are capacitated to be able to address and then solve. So they don't actually kind of solve crime. So I think if there's any role for police, it would be a very narrow one, but that we'd have to kind of strengthen community and other forms of organized, like an intervention, because it's also so policing is backward looking. The thing has kind of already happened. So and I think the big thing is there's abolishing and there's also just defunding. So it's about the fact that they get the bulk of resources in communities. And so how do you, within certain communities, if you actually didn't understand what the issues are, the police could perhaps get some, because there's certain things like, I don't know, patrolling at nights that nobody wants to do, although there are people who do community forums, but I'm trying to think of something very policey. And then the other, so I know in America, the issue is the amount of funding, and then contrasted with the lack of funding for other things. Yeah. So for me, it's really about, police could have a portion of money, but it can't be the dominant thing, because crime is largely social. Yeah, that's my thought.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, even the fact that police are the first call out in a mental health crisis doesn't seem to sit well. Like, that's just one of those examples where they shouldn't be tackling that because they're not capacitated. Let's go to Leo and Fikile. Leo and Fikile are also in our eco-social design certificate.
Hi, thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you. Nomzamo. Oh my goodness, what a conversation. So brilliant, so healing. I think for me the question, this is Fikile speaking, there's two of us here, I'm with Leonora. Also in Durban in South Africa, is the question of how do we heal ourselves, right? How do we really do the work of healing? Because I firmly believe that law is a healing practice and should be a healing practice if some of us can see it in that way. And I'm asking in the context of offending and being offended, and the realistic component of saying, how do we look at somebody, you know, take systems of oppression of the past, you know, because we all come from those systems of oppression. You spoke about colonization and how the legal fraternity in itself is framed, you know, from that colonial paradigm. South Africa, we come from apartheid. I think we are talking in the group that we have similar experiences with the US, perhaps with Brazil, and what's happening between Israel and Palestine right now. There is so much woundedness. So the legal fraternity is then aimed at saying we can heal ourselves through various means. But how does that work of healing look like outside of a prison system? And I'm one of the people that advocates for the fact that our prison systems are not assisting us. It is not helping us to take people in jail and incarcerate people, because we are fragmenting ourselves as families, we are fragmenting ourselves as communities. The very essence of indigeneity in ourselves, that being of, you know, that nature of being human, when somebody goes to prison, something fundamentally shifts, right? And that something is embedded in the legal system. So I'm very interested and really loved what you spoke about in terms of finding indigenous ways, I mean, for lack of a better word, indigenous ways of healing that remind us all the time that there's goodness in all of us, no matter how much we keep, you know, somehow offending one another. So that's just my question, because I firmly believe in that as well. Thanks.
That's a lot. So I felt like it was a statement more, but I think the question is, how do you actually heal? Like, how does a person heal individually, or how do we heal the society collectively? I
think it's both, you know, I think it's both. How do we heal? Because, you know, as individuals, we are part of the community. We are never alone. Yeah, you know, when you talk about the concept of umundu ngabantu. So for us to, for for the work of healing to happen, there's always going to be community, because offense is committed in the context of communal.
Yeah, true. And, I was taught that you can either go from the outside in, so from the people, because, your people in your community can be a way in which you make sense of yourself. You don't see yourself outside of your people. And so through those relationships, through how you maintain those relationships, through how you honor them, the relationships in this lifetime and the other ones, that becomes, that becomes a way in which your community heals. And then if you see yourself as part of that, you are also being healed. And then the other side is if you do individual healing practices, which for me have been a lot around creating space for stillness, reflection, meditation, and just actually processing the pain and being able to call it and identify it. Because I think if we don't process the pain, we lead from the pain, we work from the pain, we parent from the pain. And so there's a level of honesty and vulnerability that people have to take, that it isn't working. And I think it's quite hard because, this thing of being professional is such that the lawyers are often in a situation where they can't be that vulnerable person in front of the clients. But, I kind of imagine a world in which if I'm healing and I'm not an expert, I'm not perfect, I'm also another person, I happen to know this legal stuff, but I've also got issues. Because the other side is when we don't resolve it, then we're acting from very, if you have unresolved guilt or if you've got unresolved trauma, which a lot of people who enter the social justice space happen, then you're basically doing your work from that space. There comes in savior complexes and all of these other issues that you pile on top of the work that you do. So I think there's some level of personal responsibility to just kind of and do that work. I can't be prescriptive, as I mentioned, for some people through community. For me, it was through yoga, through breath work, through meditation, and actual dedicated and intentional practices. But I think there's so many different ways. But if there's that intention to sort of heal, I think when you're healing, you automatically kind of heal others around. But there's a level at which people have to get honest that they're broken. And I think there's a big front. We're all kind of pretending like it's okay, but it's like not. And so I don't know what it takes to break that. I think maybe it's examples of people who are willing to be, we're working in organizational spaces and we were looking at the fact that well-being creates well-doing. And what they found is that until, let's say, the leaders in these organizations normalize doing internal work and taking breaks and taking care of themselves, people aren't going to do that in an organization. So the leaders or people who are have people beneath them need to make it seen that it's important to take time, and we take things for granted. You WhatsApp people all hours, we all work over, there are all these places in which we're constantly like not doing practices which are the most regenerative and healing, and it's easy because we're all caught up. But I guess it's that awareness around this is healthy, this heals, this restores, and this doesn't. And so
I was introduced to this idea of like abolishing prison, actually through another Gaia U student who has been incarcerated, and she's got incredible writing on this idea. But I'm also deeply challenged by it as a survivor of abuse, and just like I said, the tendency to dehumanize the person on the other side, especially when we're talking about crimes of violence like we deal with in South Africa. What's kind of your stance, and like what does that look like for you? Like what are the examples that actually become restorative? Like have you gone as far as thinking about like abolishing prison systems? Is that something that you think can be worked into? Because I'm also kind of referencing one of the philosophers I've been reading lately is Deleuze, which talks about because the prison system exists and because we put prisoners in it and they're kind of out of sight and we're removing them from society, the prison walls, but they don't end there. The prison walls are in our minds and we're kind of constantly self-policing, and there's a kind of much worse, compared to the sort of older forms of tradition where you might throw tomatoes or have a big public spectacle. He feels like this removal of this actually kind of has created the surveillance state and police state inside of our own minds.
So Angela Davis, she's big in this movement, and I had the joy of seeing her when she came to South Africa, and I remember her saying, and it was just simple, she was like, we create these people and then we throw them away, and they don't fall from the sky. They are products of our societies and the inequalities, the poverty, and everything else. And so there are no simple answers, but like in abolishing prisons, you'd have to improve the education system. You'd have to, I think, it would almost have to be within different societies. It's very easy to identify what is leading to this type of crime and why is it happening. You know, there's old mining we have no economic opportunities, and then crime takes a certain character, or this has happened here, or this has happened there. So I think with a contextual look on what the factors are within that place that is leading to it, you'd have to strengthen those. And it's not short term and it's not responsive. It's about understanding that because of this, people become like this. So for example, in South Africa, because, you know, fallout from the migrant labor system and just what happened to the South African family, the brutality of apartheid, and that we've got wounds that are playing out in a specific way. So you can't, I think, you know, if you were to abolish, which I think is something to definitely look into, you have to look at what are the supporting mechanisms which mitigate the factors which are creating this thing. And then that for me is where you pour the resources and stuff into. And that, I mean, restorative justice is big on this, and they have different elements, but they, for example, facilitate meetings between the people that they must see each other, maybe not necessarily if they don't want to, but they're very they've got steps to help someone to, especially even in sort of and someone taking responsibility, accountability. And also with these things, it doesn't always for me have to be the person who experienced it like rehabilitating the person who did it to them. I think that if there's structures and stuff where that could happen, where I'm going to heal and they're going to heal, it's not my problem to heal them. I mean, I also don't want to take away from the fact that you don't have to see the humanity in your offender necessarily. I think that's your own healing journey. But structurally and systemically, we need to have things where, if that's the vision of the government, that can happen. But I don't want to put it onto the shoulders of the survivors. No question.
Oh, sorry, I just had I mean, I think you're so right. And a few times you've touched on this issue of it being more. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how this approach might apply at a systemic level, because, you know, when we try and do these things and have these different approaches, we're working within a system that's basically designed to do the opposite. And while I totally agree about the healing work and the individual work, when you're in that framework, which is basically designed, you know, capitalist extractive framework, it's going to keep replicating the same things that you're having to keep trying to resolve. So I'm wondering if there are any thoughts on how this could, you know, in terms of engaging with governments or in other ways that it could start feeding through to systemic issues and solutions.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. And I think that's also why legal strategies on their own are not enough. You need social strategies, you need policy, you need actual old school mobilization, political work, you know. So I do think that law is a tool for social change, and I also kind of fell into it initially. It's a nice idea, but I think you can't do it without the actual kind of like all the other ways in which society, so like the political reform and that. So I think it's too much for law to handle on its own, and I think the systemic comes in when you share it, because it's, yeah. And I think also within lawyers that there's a lot of vested interest within it being that way, you know. And I think that this other type of way, there's still a minority. There are many people very happy to be billing their lives away and, you know, all of that, because that's how they, yeah. So I think it is about that good old mass mobilization, get people together, gather, strategize. I think ways of strategizing are changing all the time. You know, I'm like old school. I see like how political education is happening now, TikTok. You know, there's so many different ways in which people are conscientized and changing that. I think it's just about kind of harnessing and galvanizing all of those things collectively. But I think it's a lot to put just on law. So systemic comes from the whole thing.
But could it be maybe part of law degree educations, or just different, you know, like I had never come across this term until you mentioned it. And are there ways of maybe trying to get it within the education system?
Well, exactly. That's the first place at which I think it has to start with legal education, because that's the first place where you start framing what your role is as a lawyer. And so, you know, there's a lot of within the critical legal sphere space. That's where some of them focus on legal education, and there is work that has to be done there. Absolutely, to start this at the end of when you're already formed. I think when you go out into the world as a lawyer, I think if you've got the sense of like, my values matter, I can bring them in. This is, you know, then I think that's how it becomes real. Because otherwise you're then they're already in the trap. They get jaded, and it's almost the hardening happens. It's a lot to try later. So I think it has to form part of legal education.
Brilliant. Yeah, and with that, that's our time.